So far, we managed to basically create our auto layout frames in Figma, and we copy pasted the CSS properties from the Figma dev mode into our Visual Studio Code. And if I go back to my Visual Studio Code, here you see that we have our HTML markup written, and then we added the CSS properties. So let's now understand how each CSS property works without actually copy pasting it from Figma. So the first CSS property that you need to learn about is called color. But before I get into CSS properties, I do want to give an overview of how CSS declaration look like. You need to always select your HTML element, and you always start with your curly brace. That means you have started your declaration, and then you close that with your, again, curly brace. That would basically end your declaration. And this entire thing is called CSS declaration block. And in each of them, you have properties and values. And you have two types of separator. One, which is the colon separator, and then you separate that with semicolon. That means once you add your color, for example, as a property, and you give it the value of red, you close that with a semicolon, and that separates your first declaration in CSS. And the reason we call this declaration block is because we can add as many CSS properties inside one declaration block. So for example, once we select a paragraph tag in this CSS declaration block, and we give it the color of red, it selects everything on the HTML. And this is how we would translate the previous slide into an actual CSS. Property is color, value is red, the colon separates the property from the value, and the semicolon ends the declaration. So we can have multiple declarations, and we group all of these declarations in one single declaration block by opening and closing the curly braces. An example would be, again, selecting the same paragraph and adding our first declaration, which means we are giving it the color of red, and then we close that and separate that. And then once we're done with our first declaration, we start writing our second declaration. We learned that in Figma that we can give padding to our elements and when it comes to auto layout. So here we are giving padding and basically setting the padding value to 20 pixels. So all the paragraph elements would get the value of 20 pixels. And the first CSS property that you need to learn about is color. Color allows you to change the text of an element in the HTML. So I'm going to go back to Figma, and then here, as you can see, we have two buttons. And if I click on my first button up top, here we see that we have something called fill. And if I open my button layer here on the right hand side, you see that I have something called the text. And if I click on my text, I have the ability to change the color of it in Figma. And in Figma, the color of your elements is always controlled by the fill. However, in CSS, it's different. The color of your content is controlled by a property called color, and the color of your frames is controlled by a property called background-color. So the second most important property to know in CSS is called background-color. Even though both of these are controlled using fill in Figma, in CSS you have to declare them using background-color and also color. And you have to always make sure that the property is written exactly the same way that you see it here. You can't put a space in between the property. If there is two words, you have to separate them using dash in this example. Also, when you try to write your properties, you have to respect the case sensitivity, which means you can have like capital B and then capital C when you write your properties. They have to be all lowercase with no spacing. And in terms of having a property that has two words, in this example, background color, has to be separated using dash. So now we know how to change the background color and the text color of our elements. So if I navigate back to my Visual Studio Code, here on the right hand side, we do see that we have sign up and login, and these are being rendered as paragraph elements. So what I can do is I can open my style tag by just typing style, and I can press tab on my keyboard, and now I have to select both of them. So here I would just write the letter P, space, open the curly brace, press return on my keyboard to open my declaration. Again, here, this is how we are trying to have our declaration created in Visual Studio Code. Also, let me zoom in a little bit here so we have easier time seeing this. So the first thing that we learned is the color property. So what we need to do is write color and then hold shift and colon, and then let's just give it the value of white. You can write white in this example and then add semicolon to separate that, and then as soon as I save that, they will disappear because the background is already white. We can only see the text if we give it a background color. In the Figma example, we give it a fill. So what I need to do is return and create a new line and then just write background dash color. And then what happens is if you actually write a property, Visual Studio Code recognizes it. So instead of you actually holding shift and then basically adding a colon, adding your value, in this example black, and then semicolon, you can simply select this and Visual Studio Code will add the colon and semicolon for you. So if I go ahead and save that, I'm able to see my sign up and login actually having their text color change with their background color. But if I go back to Figma, here we see that we have our first button sign up with a color red and it has also different padding. Let's also change this second one to login. There we go. And the second button is actually blue and has a different sizes. How can we individually select items in the HTML? Here in Figma, I can simply select it, go to fill and change the color to whatever I want. So I'm going to hold Command and Z to revert the color. In Visual Studio Code, you can't simply select it. You have to give it an attribute. So what is an attribute? Attribute allows you to give your HTML element a unique information. In this example, if we decide to add an image to an HTML, we would have our starting tag and then we give our attribute, and each attribute follows with an equal sign. And after the equal sign, you have basically opening and closing quotation mark. So it's up to you if you want to have a single quotation mark or a double quotation mark. What matters is you have to write your attribute in between the opening and closing tag. In this example, image is a self-closing tag, which means it doesn't have a end closing tag. If I go to paragraph, for example, paragraph is an opening tag and it has a closing tag. So that is a full HTML element that has an opening and a closing tag. So in HTML, you can also have some tags that we saw earlier, like images, with no closing tag. So basically, you would just start your HTML by writing less than sign. You give your HTML tag a name, which is a keyword. In this example, we would give it IMG, and we close that with / and greater than sign. So we have examples of self-closing tag. So if you decide to, for example, create line breaks or horizontal rule in your HTML, you could use BR to create a line break and an HR to create a horizontal rule. So these are, again, the same thing as IMG. They are self-closing tag. They don't have a closing tag at the end. You don't need to repeat BR at the end. You would just simply do a less than sign, write the keyword, in this example BR, and then you add a space, follow it by / and greater than sign. Same thing with the image. We have less than sign, a keyword of IMG, all lowercase, and then we close that with a / and greater than sign. And what matters is the attributes that we add. Each attribute, again, has keywords. So you can't just simply write source. SRC, which stands for source, is a keyword that is unique to IMG tag. Also, we have something else called alt. Alt is a unique attribute that lets your images have accessibility tags. And the anatomy of attribute is always =, opening quotation mark and closing quotation mark. In most examples, it can be double quotes, but if you do single quotes, it really doesn't matter. So for example, how do you give your attributes value? You simply add your value in between the opening quotation mark and the closing quotation mark. In this example, we are linking this image to a random website, and we are opening our IMG tag, and in between the source attribute, which is the opening quotation mark, we're passing our URL and we close our quotation mark. There are attributes that are common between all the HTML elements, and they are ID, class, and style. What I mentioned earlier was the class attribute. As you can see, image is a self-closing HTML element, so we have an ID and class attribute added to it. Also, paragraph is an element that is not self-closing. Here we have our starting element and also our closing paragraph tag. And here in the beginning, which is the starting tag, you can add your attributes. So the way it works is you would start your paragraph, less than sign, and then you add your P, which is a keyword, stands for paragraph, and then you follow that with your attributes. In this example, we care about the class attribute. We would just write the keyword class equal, and then we would pass our class name. So what happens is, as soon as you add your class, in this example, we have our paragraph. You see that we have our class of text added to our first paragraph. The way we selected in CSS is using a special character of dot. So in CSS, as soon as you add a dot, that means you are selecting your classes from HTML. And after the dot, we just type out our class name. So instead of selecting all the paragraphs, we are only selecting paragraphs that have a class of text. So now we know how to give attributes to our HTML elements. We can simply write the class attribute, and we can give our classes any name, and then we select it using dot in our CSS. And by doing that, we can uniquely style our HTML elements instead of selecting all the paragraphs. So if I go back to Visual Studio Code, here you see that we have our paragraph element, and as you can see, it selects everything. So all we need to do right now is go to our sign up, and if I try to zoom in, here you see we have less than sign, P greater than sign, and in the beginning, which is the opening tag, we add a space and we write the keyword of class. As soon as you write the class, Visual Studio Code would give you the suggestion. So if you click on it, it auto generates the equal sign, opening quotation mark, and closing quotation mark. And as you can see, the quotation marks are not single quotes. It really doesn't matter. You can use single or double, but if you're using double quotes, make sure to stick with the double quotes. So here I would just give the first one a class of sign up, but if you do that, it's actually not going to work. So you have to make sure the same way you add your properties with no space, you have to add your class names with no space as well. So if I do decide to rename my class to sign up, I have to make sure I have 0 space. So I would just write sign dash up. And if I now go back to Figma, here you see we have our sign up button with the background color of red. So if I go to Visual Studio Code, all I need to do is, instead of selecting all of these, I would just remove that. And we already know how to select classes in CSS. So if I go back to the slides, here we know that we have to use the keyword of dot. This is a special character in CSS that lets us select classes from HTML. So if I go back to Visual Studio Code, all I need to do is write dot and then follow that with the name of the class, which is sign, sign dash up. And then we give it a space and we have our curly braces created. We create our line break, and all we need to do is give it a color. Same thing, as soon as you write the CSS property, you can now select it from Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio Code would give the colon and semicolon separators. So we can just give it the color of white. Also, you can give it any hex value or HSL value. It really doesn't matter. So if I go back to Figma and if I click here you see that we have our hex value. So what I can do is I can copy that and come here to the Visual Studio Code and hold shift and create my hashtag and then paste my hex value here. And that would create the color of my text to be white. And now I need to create another line break, write background color. If you don't want to use your mouse, you can use your keyboard to navigate between different properties. And as soon as you have the property selected, all you need to do is press tab. And as you can see, I'm using tab, and Visual Studio Code would generate that CSS. So if I go back to Figma, I can select my button and copy the fill value and go back to Visual Studio Code, Command V to paste that, and now I can save this. And as you can see, the sign up is the only button on my page that actually get the background color of red and a text color of white. So you know how you can give your elements in HTML a unique class attribute and style them differently. So let's just repeat that step. All we have to do is go to our login, and we have to make sure to go with the opening tag, not the closing tag. So here I would go to my opening tag, and in between the less than sign and greater than sign, I would create a space and write the class. And then as you can see here, it auto selects it for me. So all I have to do is press tab to generate the class attribute with equal and quotation marks. I would just give it a class of login. So here I would go to my style tag, create a line break, add dot, and then login to select the login HTML element. And then I would just type in color tab and then hashtag triple F for the white text color. And then background, as soon as I write the word back, I have the ability to select the background dash color. So I can press tab on my keyboard and I can go back to Figma and I have my login here. Now I can select it, copy the fill value, go back to Visual Studio Code, and in between my login declaration block, I can add hashtag, Command V, save that. And right now you see I have the ability to uniquely style my HTML elements the same way I have the ability to style them in Figma.